Joel Rifkin was active in New York between 1989 and 1993 and is linked to 17 murders. He mainly targeted vulnerable women, especially prostitutes, which made it harder for cases to be reported quickly or taken seriously at the time. Because of this, several disappearances were not immediately connected, allowing him to continue for years without being identified. He usually approached victims in public areas and then took them to his home or his vehicle. Most of the killings were carried out by strangulation. Afterward, he disposed of the bodies in different locations across Long Island and New York City. By spreading out the locations, he avoided creating an obvious pattern, which delayed police from linking the crimes to a single person. Most victims were never identified because they had little documentation or were not reported missing. Early investigations did not connect the crimes strongly, and even when Rifkin came under minor suspicion, there was not enough evidence to hold him. This allowed him to continue operating without interruption. Everything changed on June 28, 1993. Rifkin was driving a pickup truck without a license plate when a state trooper tried to pull him over. Instead of stopping, he attempted to flee. This turned the routine traffic stop into a police chase, which quickly escalated the situation. During the chase, Rifkin lost control of the vehicle and crashed into a utility pole in Mineola, New York. When officers approached the truck, they noticed a strong odor and discovered a decomposing body in the back. The victim was later identified as Tiffany Bresciani. He was arrested after the crash and later convicted of 9 murders, receiving a sentence of 203 years to life in prison, ensuring he would never be released. His case has been featured in multiple true crime documentaries, including episodes of Forensic Files. Robert Pickton operated in British Columbia, Canada, mainly during the 1990s and early 2000s. He targeted vulnerable women, many of whom were involved in sex work or living in unstable conditions. He owned a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, and this location became central to the case. The property was isolated and large, which made it easier to avoid attention. Several women were last seen going to his farm, but these patterns were not quickly connected. The lack of coordination between cases meant that no single suspect was identified early on. There were clear warning signs that could have stopped him sooner. In 1997, a woman managed to escape from his property after being attacked and reported the incident to police. However, due to insufficient evidence and gaps in the investigation, no strong action followed. This missed opportunity allowed him to continue operating for several more years. At the same time, the number of missing women in Vancouver's downtown east side was increasing. These cases were initially handled separately, rather than as part of a larger pattern. Investigations faced criticism for delays and for not giving enough priority to victims from marginalized communities, which further slowed progress. In 2002, police entered his farm while investigating an unrelated issue involving illegal firearms. During this search, they found personal belongings linked to missing women, which raised immediate concerns. The property was then treated as a major crime scene, leading to a detailed forensic investigation. He was later charged with multiple murders and ultimately convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment with no chance of parole for at least 25 years. His case has been widely covered in true crime media, including documentaries like The Pig Farm. Lonnie Franklin Jr. operated in Los Angeles, mainly between 1985 and 2007, with a long gap in confirmed activity that led investigators to believe he had stopped. This pause gave him the nickname Grim Sleeper, as it appeared he had taken a break before continuing years later. The gap also made it harder for police to connect earlier and later cases as part of the same pattern. He targeted vulnerable women in South Los Angeles, many of whom were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. Franklin used a consistent method, often involving a firearm, and left bodies in public or semi-public areas. Despite similarities in the cases, early investigations did not fully connect them, partly due to limited resources and fragmented case handling. This delay allowed him to continue operating without being identified as a repeat offender. Over time, investigators began to notice patterns linking the crimes, including similarities in victim profiles and forensic evidence. However, identifying a specific suspect remained difficult for many years. Traditional investigative methods did not lead to a clear breakthrough. The case eventually progressed through the use of familial DNA analysis. Investigators linked crime scene evidence to a relative of Franklin, whose DNA was in a database, which helped narrow down the suspect pool. This approach was crucial because Franklin himself had no direct DNA record in the system. He was later convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to death, with an additional life sentence without parole. His case was widely covered in true crime media, including the documentary The Grim Sleeper. Harold Shipman worked as a general practitioner in England for decades and built a strong reputation as a trusted family doctor. His position gave him direct access to patients, especially elderly individuals who often lived alone, which reduced immediate suspicion when deaths occurred under his care. He administered lethal doses of medication, often diamorphine, and then certified the deaths himself. Because he was a licensed doctor, his documentation was usually accepted without question. Many of the deaths were recorded as natural causes, which allowed the pattern to continue without raising early alarms. Over time, the number of deaths among his patients became unusually high compared to other doctors in the area. However, these patterns were not immediately identified as suspicious, because the deaths were spread out and involved elderly patients, which made them seem less unusual at first. There were early warning signs that could have led to intervention. In the late 1990s, concerns were raised about the number of cremation forms he signed, as well as inconsistencies in medical records. An initial investigation took place, but due to lack of clear evidence at the time, no action was taken, allowing him to continue. Suspicion increased when the family of one patient questioned the circumstances of her death and raised concerns about a will that had been altered. This led to closer examination of medical records and eventually to remains of dead humans, which revealed evidence inconsistent with natural causes. He was later convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment after an inquiry linked him to over 200 patient deaths. His case has been widely covered in true crime media, including documentaries like Harold Shipman, Driven to Kill. Joseph James DeAngelo operated in California during the 1970s and 1980s and was linked to a series of burglaries, assaults, and murders across multiple regions. His crimes were initially investigated under different names, including the East Area and the original Night Stalker, which delayed the realization that a single person was responsible. He targeted residential areas, often entering homes at night while victims were asleep. His method showed planning and consistency, including surveillance of neighborhoods beforehand and control over victims once inside. Despite repeated incidents, identifying a suspect proved difficult due to limited forensic technology at the time. Investigators collected DNA evidence from crime scenes, but for many years there was no match in existing databases. As a result, the case remained unsolved even though strong forensic evidence existed. Over time, the different crime series were eventually linked. The breakthrough came decades later with the use of genetic genealogy. Investigators compared crime scene DNA with publicly available genealogy databases to identify possible relatives. This allowed them to narrow down potential suspects and eventually focus on DeAngelo. He had lived a normal life for years, working as a police officer earlier in his life and later blending into suburban society. He was identified after investigators secretly obtained his DNA from discarded items and matched it to crime scene evidence. He had managed to avoid identification for over 4 decades due to lack of technology. He was later linked to 13 murders and dozens of assaults, and in 2020, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Richard Ramirez operated in California between 1984 and 1984 and was responsible for a series of home invasions, assaults, and murders across Los Angeles and San Francisco. His attacks appeared random, targeting men, women, and couples at different ages, which made it difficult for investigators to establish a clear victim pattern early on. He typically entered homes at night, often through unlocked doors or windows, and used a variety of weapons including firearms and knives. The lack of a consistent method and the wide geographic spread of the crimes made it harder for police to quickly connect all incidents to a single individual. For months, there was no clear suspect, and public fear increased as the attacks continued. Investigators relied on limited forensic evidence, including shoe prints and eventually a fingerprint, but identifying the person behind them took time. During this period, Ramirez remained active and unidentified. The turning point came when his fingerprint was matched in a criminal database, giving police a confirmed identity. His photo was released to the public, which led to widespread recognition. Shortly after, he was spotted by civilians, chased, and detained until police arrived. He was later convicted of 13 murders along with multiple counts of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary, and was sentenced to death, where he remained on death row until his death in 2013. Andrei Chikatilo operated in the Soviet Union from 1978 to 1990 and is known for at least 50 murders, mostly of women and children. His crimes were spread across the Russian, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, which made the investigation harder because the cases were handled in different places and were not linked quickly. He often targeted people who were vulnerable or alone, and he used forest areas, train stations, and remote places to avoid attention. Even when police were looking for the killer, early evidence did not lead to a clear match. and for a time he was wrongly removed from suspicion because the blood evidence did not fit what investigators expected. A major reason he came close to getting away was the long delay between the early murders and the final arrest in 1990. The case involved many false leads, missed connections, and investigative errors, which let him continue for years before the pattern was fully understood. He was later tried for 53 murders, convicted of 52 of them, and also found guilty of 5 counts of sexual assault. In October 1992, he was sentenced to death plus 86 years in prison, and he was executed by gunshot in February 1994. His case was later dramatized in the TV film Citizen X, and it also inspired later films such as Evelenko and Ghoul. Ted Bundy operated mainly in the 1970s across several U.S. states, including Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. He often targeted young women, especially students, and he used a friendly and trustworthy manner to gain their attention before attacking. He was able to move between states and avoid capture for a long time. In Colorado, he escaped custody twice, once by jumping from a law library window and later by cutting through the ceiling of his jail cell. His final major crimes happened in Florida, where he attacked women at Chi Omega sorority house and later murdered a child named Kimberly Leach. He was arrested after a traffic stop in 1978, which ended his run. He was later convicted to at least 30 killings overall and sentenced to death, remaining on death row until his execution in 1989. His case has been featured in many books, documentaries, and films, including Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. Israel Keyes operated across the United States between the early 2000s and 2012, traveling widely and committing crimes in different states to avoid detection. He planned his actions in advance, sometimes burying kill kits with weapons and tools in remote locations years before using them, which allowed him to act without leaving immediate evidence. He paid in cash, avoided digital trails, and often chose locations far from where he lived. He maintained a normal public life. The case turned when he abducted an 18-year-old woman, Samantha Koenig, in Alaska. After the crime, he used the victim's bank card, which created a traceable record. He was arrested in Texas after being identified through ATM surveillance and transaction records. He later confessed to multiple murders, was linked to at least 3 confirmed victims with several more suspected, but died by suicide in 2012 before trial, leaving many details of his crimes unresolved. Dennis Rader operated in Wichita, Kansas, between 1974 and 1991, and was responsible for a series of murders that he claimed, using the name BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. He communicated with police and media through letters, describing details of his crimes, which created public fear. Despite this, identifying him proved difficult because he left very little usable forensic evidence and maintained a normal public life, working regular jobs and participating in community activities. After 1991, the killing stopped and the case went cold for many years. In 2004, he began communicating again with media and law enforcement, sending letters and digital materials. A major mistake occurred when he sent a floppy disk to police, believing it could not be traced. Metadata from the disk was linked to a computer at a church and, eventually, to Rader himself. He was arrested in 2005 and later convicted of 10 murders, receiving 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years in prison. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, operated in Washington from the early 1980s through the 1990s. He was linked to the murders of women and girls, and he dumped bodies in remote or wooded areas around King County and nearby locations, when DNA testing linked him to the murders, and he was arrested in November 2001. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 murders to avoid the death penalty and to help investigators locate victims' remains. He was sentenced to 49 life sentences without parole. Samuel Little operated across the United States between the 1970s and early 2000s. He targeted vulnerable women. Little was arrested multiple times over the years for unrelated offenses, including drug charges. There was not enough evidence at the time to connect him to the killings, allowing him to continue operating. The breakthrough came years later when DNA evidence connected him to several crime scenes. He later confessed to 93 murders, with 60+ confirmed by authorities, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, where he remained until his death in 2020. Pedro Lopez operated in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 1970s and early 1980s. He was known as the Monster of the Andes, and is widely believed to have killed at least 110 people, while some reports put the number much higher, even above 300. He mostly targeted young girls, He was arrested in 1980 in Ecuador after a girl recognized him and alerted others, which led to his capture. At trial, he was charged with 57 murders and sentenced to 16 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence available there at the time. He was later released early and eventually committed to a mental hospital in Colombia. Luis Garabito operated in Colombia during the 1990s. He targeted young boys. Many of the victims came from vulnerable backgrounds. Garabito kept detailed notes about his crimes. He was eventually identified and arrested after a witness provided information that led police to him. He later confessed to over 140 murders, was convicted of 180 counts, and was sentenced to a total of more than 12,800 years in prison, though Colombian law limited his actual time to around 40 years. He died in prison in 2023. Zodiac Killer operated in Northern California during the late 1960s and is linked to a series of shootings and stabbings. He targeted couples in isolated areas. He became widely known not just for the crimes, but for the letters he sent to newspapers, where he included cryptograms and details that only the killer would know. Despite having witness descriptions, fingerprints, and other evidence, investigators were unable to definitively identify him. The Zodiac Killer was linked to 5 confirmed murders with several more suspected, but he was never caught or convicted, making it one of the most famous unsolved serial killer cases in history.